So yeah, I was saying I haven't spoken to you for years.
I sit there looking at some of my music stuff, like it's going, why is nothing happening? For like half an hour.
Yeah,
Anyway.
no, absolutely. Why have you written a book?
Well, it's been, the idea has been floating around with me and Faber for a number of years, since 2015, 17 maybe. And it was going to be, an art book, really. It was going to be about, filled with not so serious drawings, and then some of my more serious attempts at painting, etc. And then there was staff changes, there was amount of time went by, and we decided to attack it a little more. It just seemed like a good idea to do it maybe with a journalist or with a writer as well, to lighten the load with me and do it a little more conversationally. And so it seemed like a good idea in autumn 2020 to let's get back on track with this thing and get on with it. But why? It seemed to make sense at that point in my life to do some sort of memoir. It's not what I had in mind to start with, although it's a good punctuation point, I suppose. 2020. It's a pretty big punctuation point for everybody, really. The lockdown and it just seemed like a good way to appraise and examine what had brought me to the point I was at in autumn 2020.
I guess I just, as a fan of your music, and like I was like a Graham guy, like when I was a teenager, like it almost, I don't know, like it just feels a bit like a very un-Graham Coxon move from what I know of you, to like bare stuff, like I'm not saying that. Well, you never really seem like someone that actually wants people to know a lot about you. You're like the
Well, I think I've actually overshared most of my life through lyrics and things like that. I've not been particularly, I could be a lot more guarded. Maybe as a human being, I'm a little more guarded, a bit more of an actor in my own life. But I think within songs, I've never really been afraid to be kind of very open or straight talking about stuff. So it's not like I was setting any records straight or anything like that either, or wanting to bitch about anybody. It was just, it started as a thing about how I relied on art and drawing, and turned into how that applied throughout my life and bands I've been in, and all of the rest of it. And then, of course, once you start bringing all the things in, like bands and touring, then other elements of my life sort of get included. And those things that get included are very often the things that are not always positive, and the things that are always quoted on Twitter. And then I have to go and flip and explain why I've said it. This quote that floats there without really any
framing. Yeah.
Because I suppose I can say quite a lot of things that can be taken wrongly, or can be framed in such a way as to wind up fans or other things, and in themselves they're not offensive to anybody. They're just things that some of the fans might and might get all dramatic about, like if I mention something about Damon, it's like, oh gosh, he said this about Damon, you know, but it's nothing I've said is very controversial. You know, we've known each other a long, long time, and people say say all sorts of things about their family members and close friends that are far worse, you know.
When can I ask you some fun?
I mean, I can only say these things because I feel very secure in our relationship, Damon and me.
Can I ask you some fan questions?
Yeah.
When did Blur stop being? When was there a moment in Blur where you started to go, "Oh, this isn't really what I wanted it to be"?
Well, it goes from great, oh crikey, it's like this, is it? And then mild panic, and then when it becomes a business, I suppose, when that side of it becomes so apparent in meetings and with even conversations with other band members, you know, about next moves, breaking America. When I felt like my own people were talking their language, you know, I started to get resentful. It's nobody's fault because there isn't any other language for it. Or, you know, you could, instead of saying break America, I suppose you could say something else. We can really attempt to do well in America, and this requires us to tour for 10 months over there. But I was nothing would have been right for me as a personality in those days, really. You know, there was so much to rail against, so much to complain about, but it didn't require much effort for me to be Mardy. What I really should have done was been more grateful for my good fortune, and looked after myself better, and just, you know, enjoyed it innocently.
What
Instead of not enjoying it in a kind of innocent sort of way as well. I was a brat, really. I was a bit petulant.
that sounds like there's been a lot of learning between then and now. Like, how did you, like, when did you start seeing things in that way?
Well, that sort of passion is what makes music good and what makes bands good. You know, when you've settled down throughout your 30s and mellowed out, and then maybe learned some more about yourself, maybe even had therapy or group therapy, or been to a few meetings, maybe you're a little more accepting of things. Maybe that is when people get older, their music gets more rubbish, because that sort of that fiery, young, uncompromising outlook starts to the edges get knocked off it. I don't think it always means that you well, certainly in my case, it doesn't mean that you make rubbish music when you're older. But I can see how that sort of happens. I think musically I'm still very young, and I'm panicking about how many years there are to make music. And then that makes me see Damon in a different light, how his drive and his work ethic, actually, why he might be almost like a shark that doesn't want to stay still and for very long, you know, in case he sinks. He is a creative animal, and he keeps going. So maybe that is the point of youth. And I'm not saying I should have been any other way. That was the negative in that band that I filled.
Right.
With myself, and other people had their own spaces, but we were pretty chocker as a band with personalities and fun.
Do you wish you were like? I mean, it sounds like it was. This was never on the cards, but do you wish you were still? Do you wish you were still doing it at like the apex of what you were?
Well, it's great putting out an album and there being a massive song and dance. I don't know if that happens to anybody now, but it did happen in the 90s, and I'd like to have maybe had insider information about the future of the music business in the 90s. Maybe I would have sort of thought, well, in a few years, it's going to be very, very different.
Right.
I don't mean worse.
So, explain a bit more what you mean by that.
Well, it was kind of like the last hurrah of the music business. It's when the music business, the big record companies, foolishly, really, I guess in a way, were able to really throw money around.
Yeah.
So it was an extension of the 60s, or the 70s, 80s, and 90s, I suppose. And then things got an awful lot more frugal, and the record labels were a little sort of smug, I suppose, in the what is it? A bit too, not smug, contented. Another word. There was definitely a storm, a black cloud coming, and people like Dave, our drummer, he knew the internet was developing, and he sort of saw a future where this was going to be a bit challenging for record labels, but no one really wanted to take much notice.
So, what you're saying? If you'd had an idea of what the future held, do you think that Blur could have weathered some of the problems you had, like late 90s, early noughties, and continued?
Probably not. It probably would have done the same. I think we needed the rest. The thing about the 90s is it was in one case, in one way, a last hurrah for the music industry, but it was bloody an exhausting merry-go-round of recording, touring, scraping together some B-sides. Each release had to have about 10 tracks, because you had to have something different on CD2, you had to have something different on the 12-inch, you had to have something different on the 7-inch, you had to have something different on the cassette, So every release was like really scraping together an album's worth of material. It was pretty ridiculous. And how can you do that when you're on tour, when you have to use a day off and find some studio somewhere and knock a few things together, get a few things out. There was a song called Swallows in the Heat Wave and St. Louis song that we had, which were done. We've got a day off. We need B-sides. It's like, oh man, a day off. No, we got to go in a bloody studio.
Swallows in Heat Wave's fucking class, though.
But I do like those songs. Yeah. But but they're very, they're very tourish.
Yeah, I can see that.
But I don't know whether I'd have been any different. I was just how I was, regretfully in a lot of ways, but I see how that is how I had to be. It's not that I was unreasonable or horrid, but when a bunch of boys are partying a lot and they're very, very tired out and they've got a busy schedule, and then their sort of time off has been snatched away to do a bunch of radio interviews all day, or to go and have to record something. It's like, you just get exhausted, and it can get a bit fractious.
What do you think it was about you that found booze ultimately so hard?
That found what?
Well, what do you think it was about you that where drink spilled over into it being a problem?
It gave me a peace of mind, I suppose. It quietened the negative self-talk. It made socializing easier. I certainly became, for a while, more entertaining to talk to. It lubricates the tongue a little better. There's an interesting sketch, I forget who it was, and it was it's a sketch about martinis, and he has his first and his second and his third, and I forget who that was. It just come to me, but it's an interesting thing.
Right.
but I could never really. I'm just that sort of person. I mean, that's a sort of a kind of a little bit of an addictive personality.
Right.
That, if I open a bar of chocolate, I know that there's not going to be any left in 20 minutes.
Yeah, I'm very similar in
And
that
and
regard.
it's like, I mean, I could go out and have 4 pints and then go home, if I really wanted to. But there was a couple of times when I found it when I was on a bit of a bender and I just couldn't stop. And I was like, shit, I can't actually stop. I'm not brave enough to put up with the repercussions of stopping, which would have been a lot of anxiety, really terrible anxiety, walking up and down in a room, or a house, until I didn't have steps on my phone, how many steps I would have walked on my phone, but it would probably be like 8,000. And I think, oh my God, I'm just going to go out and walk. And, that sort of walk, the anxiety would be very strong. I don't know whether that's because I was weak or couldn't tolerate the anxiety. And it was the same sort of anxiety that other people sort of felt. But no one talked about it. But for me, certainly it was difficult to bear.
There is a quote, I'm going to fudge it, but the essence of it, that I remember from being a kid that you said, which is basically about hedonism, which is almost kind of like, I'm a hedonist, almost like, what else is there? Or I'm a hedonist, or like everything else is just kind of killing time.
Yeah. I don't even know what I meant by that. I think that was claptrap. I don't think I even know what a hedonist is.
Well, someone who like lives for pleasure, really.
Yeah, but the thing is, yes, that would have been all very well. But I'm not sure I live for pleasure, because I had my responsibilities, and I've always made sure that I meet my responsibilities. Maybe not all the time with the band,
Yeah.
but I've certainly never wanted to be a bad man. I've worked very hard on always, even back then, in bettering myself or improving as a person, as a musician, and all of the rest of it. I think I was just being a little bit pretentious, saying, I mean, maybe there was that. I mean, drinking and going to the pub and having parties is certainly a nice way to live, but it does cost you in the end. And it's sort of, your emotional development takes a beating, because you're sort of living in a sort of a suspension. You're not really doing anything. You're not living in reality, which is very attractive. But when you've got kids and things like that, that's not on, really.
No, totally. Did Blur get festival and tour offers?
Did they?
No, do they?
I don't think they do.
Really? Like in a sort of
I think they only offer going concerns, don't they?
well, no, I definitely feel like there's this weird space right now where
Well, if they do, I don't hear about it. I think you have to sort of put your name in a hat now for like 2025, don't you?
there's definitely someone attached to Blur who is getting big money offers of festival slots. There's
Excellent.
there's definitely a conversation happening at like Glastonbury every couple of years. I'm sure of it. But that never trickles down into the Graham Coxon ecosystem.
Well, not really. Probably because somebody's mid-project. If Gorillaz are touring that year, what's the point in asking Blur to do a festival?
Is that weird though? Like, is it like great? Like Damon's obviously like one of the best songwriters within my lifetime, right?
Is that
Like,
obvious?
of course it is. It's like preposterous. I went to see him at the
Yeah,
bar. I went to see him at the Barbican recently, and I was just like, how can you be? How can you be that good? But
he
like,
works hard.
do you think that's what it is, though?
Yeah,
Like, okay, how do
yeah.
you?
I mean, you don't just wake up and be able to write great songs. You know, Damon's written songs that I was like, oh, bastard. I wish I'd have written that. You know, he's written loads of those.
Right,
And but it's not like he hasn't got probably 2,000 songs that were rubbish, you know,
right,
that
right,
no one will ever hear.
right.
You know, that's just how it goes. And the more you work, the more you flex those muscles, the more better ones are amongst the bad ones, you know. And if you're doing that every day, how many songs do you think you've got after 6 months?
Yeah,
I mean, if you're getting 2 or 3 ideas together a day, and you're doing that every day for 6 months, or at least 5 times a week for 6 months, I mean, do the maths. How many songs is that?
right. Yeah.
So, you know, it's work ethic. That's why I said that I admire his work ethic. And when I was doing my soundtracks, I got a sort of, you know, I was doing a sort of a 9 to 5 similar sort of thing. And yeah, I mean, after a few weeks, you've got like 300 songs. It's like flipping out. They're not all good, but there's things going on, and you're oiling the machinery. And the more you do it, the more good songs come out of it.
Is it weird? I mean, I would have, you know, as like a Blur nut in my teens and early 20s, like I would have never envisaged, you know, Blur almost being like the, God, how do I frame this without being disrespectful? Like almost like the,
I don't mind it.
almost like the lesser concern, right? As in like gorillas are like kind of a bit of a phenomenon, really. Like, is that weird? Like for you, does that feel weird? Like it definitely feels like not something you ever could have envisaged, like on stage at the Brits or whatever.
Yeah, but you know, that was an idea he had that really caught on. I mean, I caught on. It's just one of those things that I don't know. I know. I found it odd listening to early Gorillaz. It was like, oh, this is kind of. I don't. Is it odd? I don't know what he was planning. Like Blur didn't know they were that Britpop and all of that was just around the corner when we were recording Pop Scene.
Yeah.
We didn't know that hadn't happened. We were just another group, and there was other groups in Britain making music. So I'm not sure that he knew when he went into that as a sort of a concept with Jamie that years down the line it would be that big.
Right.
But I suppose he needed to explore other something outside of a sort of a classic band lineup, and that's fair enough. We all need that sometimes, you know. If we've been involved in a classic lineup, you know, what happens if we drag a bit of hip hop in, use electronic drums, use more synths, create characters, you know, what happens if we do that? And what if those characters aren't, you know, what if this band isn't really real, and I can hide behind all this and not have to really do all the crappy work that used to get on my nerves in Blur, you know? Yeah, it sounds like a good idea. And that suddenly is, you know, Jamie creating this amazingly cute band, and it fires the imagination, and of course is thick with hooks, and guests. You know, he's certainly got an awful lot of confidence, Damon, to approach people he has approached over the years, you know.
I guess what's interesting in a way though is just that, you know, the narrative has always really been that, you almost that like Blur couldn't be everything that you needed, like whether that was just your like musical ethos or the music that you were into. Whereas, like, do you think it was a bit that Blur and you couldn't offer Damon what he needed?
I think it's the same with both of us. I think Blur can't give you everything you need. I think I had to learn how to write songs. That's not why Blur and I went our separate ways for a while. That's not the reason for it. But I realized that it would be good to try and write my own songs. And I may not have even bothered trying if an old neighbor of mine hadn't sort of written a script for a film and said, "Oh, you're a bloody musician, write us a couple of songs for this film." And I was like, "What?" And gave it a go.
Right.
And they were a couple of songs that ended up on my Skies Too High album. I probably wouldn't have bothered, but but I'm glad I did.
It's a good record, that.
Well, lots of people love that record. But I think we all need to develop as musicians, and in a lot of ways, we need to be selfish about that, because no one's going to encourage you to go off and do something outside of the band that is doing, pretty well.
Yeah.
You're doing really great in Blur. Why don't you put it aside and start some weird cartoon band? Why don't you go off, Graham, and just do some self-produced, like, funny little records?
Yeah.
It doesn't seem like, it doesn't really make much sense. So, but these are risks we have to take, and we need to take, not necessarily in public. I mean, we took all of our risks in public, and I've developed as a songwriter and a guitar player in public. We don't need to do it, but as part of our own development as people, and as musicians, and there's a need to do that.
Has there ever been a point where you kind of fell out of love with music?
No, I fell out in love with the general public and the record buying public. They don't know what's good. Of course, I fall out of love with the sort of the business and the way things are done. I still don't like the fact that there isn't a Top of the Pops on Thursday night at 7:30. I still don't like that Jules Holland isn't a longer these days, or has more bands. I love that it's just up the road from where I live. But no, I've never fallen out in love with music. Music has absolutely always been there for me. It's like the objects I surround myself with, or the objects I've found throughout my life that I hold dear as little treasures. Music is very personal to me, and I get most enjoyment out of music when I listen to it in solitude. It's not really a social thing for me. It really is connected with mental health for me.
Oh, explain that.
Sorry?
Just can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Well, it's something that reminds me of who I am. If I listen to L'Amour Looks Something Like You by Kate Bush, then I'm transported. I find it overwhelming. I find it just beautiful. I go through different layers of myself to age 10, to age 16, 18, 32. It's almost like, a stone that you found under a tree, or like me, that weird vase I found under a tree on the army estate. I've still got it, and it connects me to myself right the way through my past. And talk in 2020, every day I'll be listening to The Laughing Stock, that album, because of I was suffering a lot of anxiety in 2020. My mum was extremely ill. I was going through therapy. A lot had happened in that year that had really knocked me sideways. And into 2021, 21, yeah, still, and into working with Rose. I was still feeling this sort of anxiety, and every morning sort of almost meditating to like talk and stuff like that. So it is connected with me. I wouldn't go, let's sit down and listen to like The Kick Inside with a friend of mine.
Right.
It's like it's just I don't know why. I mean, it's just very personal to me. Or
No, I get that. I understand that now.
I mean, I
Have
can
you?
have it on during dinner or something when there's some friends around, but it's that sort of intense listening is something that I only do on my own.
As a man, the age you are now, when you think about the man you were when you were like 20, do you like that guy?
I like him because I see him around still a lot. um, and he wouldn't take probably any advice, just like nobody young would from someone my age now.
And
Yeah,
and
I like
shouldn't
him. I
really,
think he was a bit of a pain. Sorry?
and shouldn't really. I've got this big thing about
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. Sorry, you were saying.
he shouldn't. And they go, people, no one really said to me, gave me much advice when I was growing up. I really just learned everything in the hard way, really. So maybe I would give him a bit of advice. I would, there was a few things I'd like him, and I'd probably like him enough to care about him and go, hey, But that's what this book is. I'm kind of trying to do that a little bit.
Nice.
No one warned you about this. No one says this. Perhaps people should. It is part of. People are so deep. People are so into mental health now. Perhaps these things should be taught more in school. I know they are. I mean, people are sort of talking about it, and it's a thing that's talked about. But there are some specifics that maybe need talking about a little more.
It's interesting actually. I'm writing a book at the moment. My deadline is far too imminent,
Looming. Yeah.
and it's about mental health. It's about I have OCD, and it's basically about being a music journalist with OCD.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting having been like that kind of archetypal indie kid and getting to know a lot of the people whose music I loved when I was growing up, just how, obviously naming no names because it would be unfair, but like just how many people are struggling at like almost your age of life with like mental illness.
Yeah.
And almost like you guys were like almost, I listen to you guys more than I listen to teachers, right? Or my parents. Like, did it feel like that at the time? Did it feel like there were problems brewing with people maybe later down the line, or did it just feel like the innocence of youth?
It feels like an abandonment. Yes, an innocence of youth. I think generally, not just musicians, but everybody has a problem when they get older.
Right.
I think the eccentricities or the idiosyncrasies of people are good and bad get amplified as you get older. I think I could spend all day just faffing around, moving things, removing things, tidying up. I don't get crazily anxious about things. I like things to be scruffy in the right way. But I think that people struggle with their own relevance, I guess, as they get older. I think they see the world as a more dangerous place. Maybe the world is a more dangerous place. I don't know whether the world gets more dangerous or it's pushed on the TV as getting more dangerous, or
It feels
we feel more danger as we get older.
It does feel a bit more dangerous than I remember it being in my lifetime.
Yeah, but nuclear war was always there.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's difficult for men and women to get older. It is, and with how they look and feel, and
I definitely can't end this on it's difficult for men and women to get older.
well, getting old isn't easy. That's it. You know,
That is the truth. That is the truth.
but in a lot of ways, it's really great. You don't have to. I will never give up. I mean, that's what I have learned, that I'm actually emotionally very strong, and my mental health is pretty bloody good. There's been, you know, it's been knocked quite a lot, but I've always wanted to look after myself and become better. So I haven't really given any of the things that could get bad much of a chance to really set in. I do have a resilience, and I do have determination. That's why I'm still making music. That's why it's still my favorite thing to do in this room. You know, this is where the Wave was recorded in here.
Yeah.
It's just a small space, but the inner space is vast. You know, the inner life where I've spent most of my time is a big place.
It's been dead nice chatting, Graham. Just before I leave you, other than the book, what are you? What are the projects you're working on that you can tell me about?
Well, getting ready for doing some gigs with the Wave. Their album out, Me and Rose. The Wave's album is out on the 3rd of February next year. That's been extremely exciting. We got together without really knowing each other that well at all, really, to do a couple of songs. I ended up making an album and a lot more besides, and that was extraordinary to me. You know, to meet someone who was very much from my own species. I thought someone who had been floating around out there for a long time, to be suddenly making music that I really thought was bloody good, and meant a lot to me and meant a lot to her. I thought that was something amazing that came out of lockdown and the issues that all chucked up in both of our faces. And apart from that, writing, really, mucking about on a synthesizer.
Do you have any idea when you might have a new solo record?
Well, I've still got one sitting around from years ago, about 10 years ago.
All right.
Called Castle Park, but I'm not sure when that can come out. But yeah, I suppose Graham Coxon should rear his ugly head at some point.
Yeah, don't leave it too long.
But it's good having different things. I thought the Superstate thing was really, really overlooked. I was very proud of that album. Perhaps it got confused with all the artwork and everything, but I thought that was a really good bit of work. It took me 4 years. I put a lot into it. So that the Superstate thing and the Wave is really what I want to concentrate on. But Graham Coxon, yeah, he should maybe do something. That's another change of costume. It's like put the stripy T-shirt on for him.
Get in the phone booth and twirl around a few times.
Yeah.
Graham, thanks so much for the chat, man. I'm sure I'll see you down the line at some point.
Yeah, come to some Wave gigs.
Yeah, looking forward to it. See you, man. Cheers, bye, dude.